They dragged her by her arms off the train, her body jerking against the rough hands of the conductor and two other men. Her dress tore, her hat flew off. Blood rushed to her face, as passengers watched, some cheering, some silent. But what they would remember most was not her humiliation. What burned into their memory was the moment when Ida B. Wells sank her teeth into the conductor's hand so hard he screamed, when she braced her feet against the seat and refused to be moved without a fight. She was 22 years old, and on that spring day in 1884, on that Chesapeake and Ohio train in Tennessee, something crystallized inside her that would reshape American history. This was not the first time the world had tried to put her in her place. It would not be the last, but Ida Bell Wells had decided something fundamental about herself and about her life. She would not go quietly. This is the story of a woman who was born enslaved 6 months before the Emancipation Proclamation and who would die 69 years later, having shaken the foundations of American injustice. This is the story of a daughter, a teacher, a journalist, a mother, and a revolutionary who understood that silence in the face of terror is its own kind of violence. This is the story of how one woman armed with nothing but a pen, a printing press, and an unbreakable will went to war against lynching in America and changed what was possible for every Black woman who came after her. But to understand the warrior, you must first understand the child who was forged in fire. Holly Springs, Mississippi, 1862. The world Ida Bell Wells entered on July 16 was a world at war with itself. 6 months earlier, Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But for enslaved people in Mississippi, freedom was still a distant promise, obscured by the smoke of battle and the uncertainty of survival. Her mother, Elizabeth Lizzie Wells, was known as Polly before freedom came, and her father, James Wells, was a carpenter enslaved on the bowling plantation. They were both people of mixed race, carrying in their very bodies the violence of slavery, their light skin a testament to sexual exploitation that white slaveholders inflicted on enslaved women. But they were also people of fierce determination and dignity who refused to let that history define them. When freedom finally came crashing across the South in the wake of Union victory, James and Lizzie Wells seized it with both hands. They did something enslaved people had dreamed of for generations. They found each other again after the chaos of war, married in a ceremony the law would actually recognize, and began building a life entirely their own. James became a master carpenter, his skills in high demand in a region trying to rebuild from ashes. He was meticulous in his work, known for buildings that stood straight and true. He charged fair prices but never undervalued his labor. He understood that freedom meant the right to profit from your own skill, to negotiate your own terms, to walk away if you were not treated with respect. Lizzie Wells became a cook known throughout Holly Springs for her skill and her standards. She could make something delicious out of almost nothing, a skill honed during years of slavery when feeding a family meant stretching scraps into meals. But now she cooked for her own family first, and when she cooked for others, she was paid for her labor. They bought a house, an act that still seems miraculous when you consider that just years earlier, they had been property themselves, unable to own even the clothes on their backs. They filled it with children. Ida was the oldest, followed by James, George, Annie, Lily, and Stanley Ann filled it with something more precious, a vision of what Black life could be in freedom. But what they gave Ida was more than property. They gave her a vision of what Black people could be in freedom. Her father became a man who spoke his mind in town meetings, who fought for Black political rights during Reconstruction, who joined the Masons and became active in local Republican politics. He read the newspaper aloud each evening, turning their modest home into a schoolhouse. He discussed politics and current events with his children as if their opinions mattered, as if they had every right to understand and participate in shaping their world. When Ida asked questions, and she always asked questions, he answered seriously, never dismissing her because she was young or female. Her mother, despite never learning to read herself, insisted all her children would be educated. She had lived her entire childhood in a world that made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. A world that understood literacy was power, and power in Black hands was dangerous to white supremacy. Now that freedom had come, Lizzie Wells was determined her children would have what had been stolen from her. Education, she understood, with a clarity born from deprivation, was the weapon that could not be taken away, the tool that could pry open doors hate had sealed shut. Ida absorbed these lessons the way plants absorb sunlight. She attended Shaw University, later called Rust College, a school founded by the Freedmen's Aid Society. The teachers were Northern missionaries, mostly white, who had come south with genuine idealism but also with assumptions about what Black children could learn. Ida challenged those assumptions. She was a voracious reader, devouring everything from Charles Dickens to Frederick Douglass, from poetry to philosophy. She learned that language could be a weapon as powerful as any sword, that social criticism could reshape the world. She was also strong-willed and quick-tempered, a child who would not accept injustice even in small things. She argued with teachers when she thought they were wrong, when they made assumptions about Black people's capabilities. She defended her younger siblings fiercely against anyone who tried to bully or demean them. She carried inside her a burning sense that the world should be fair and that she had both the right and the responsibility to say so when it was not. Her parents, rather than trying to tame this spirit, nurtured it. Her father told her that being smart and being proud were not sins, that the world would try to make her feel small, but she should resist that with everything she had. Those early years in Holly Springs were as close to idyllic as a Black childhood could be in Mississippi during Reconstruction. The family had enough to eat. The children went to school. On Sundays they attended church, where the formerly enslaved gathered not just to worship but to organize, to share information, to build community institutions. There were moments of joy: holiday celebrations, church picnics, the simple pleasure of children playing in the street on summer evenings while parents sat on porches and talked about the future they were building. For a brief window, it seemed possible that Black people in the South might actually achieve something like equality. But childhood ended for Ida B. Wells on a single day in 1878, when she was 16 years old. Yellow fever swept through Holly Springs that summer, like the angel of death, claiming victims by the hundreds. The disease was not well understood. People died within days, their skin turning yellow, their bodies racked with fever and vomiting blood. The wealthy fled, but poor people, Black and white, had nowhere to go. They stayed and hoped and prayed and died. James Wells, the strong carpenter who had built a life out of nothing, fell ill and died. Lizzie Wells, who had survived slavery and built a family in freedom, fell ill and died. Stanley, the baby, barely a year old, fell ill and died. Within days of each other, they were gone. Neighbors helped bury them. 3 more graves among hundreds dug that terrible summer. And Ida, visiting her grandmother's farm when the epidemic hit, returned to find her world shattered. Her parents buried, her baby brother cold in the ground, and her 5 surviving siblings looking to her for salvation. The moment when Ida truly grew up was not gradual. It was instant and irreversible. She stood in the house that was now hers, looked at the faces of her brothers and sisters. James was 11, George was 9, Annie was 5, Lily was 3, and understood that everything had changed. Family friends meant well, but their solution was to split the family up, send the children to different relatives. Someone suggested the girls be sent to the county poor farm. Someone else suggested the older children find work as servants in white households. Ida, standing in her mourning clothes, looking at her siblings' terrified faces, made a decision that would determine her entire life. She said no. The family would not be separated. She would take care of them. She was 16. She had no money and no time to grieve, but she had no intention of letting her siblings be scattered, of letting them grow up as charity cases, of letting them lose the vision of Black dignity and possibility their parents had given them. The train incident in 1884 was not really about a train. It was about the systematic destruction of everything Reconstruction had promised to Black people in the South. After federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, white Democrats had begun a campaign of terror and legal maneuvering designed to strip Black citizens of every gain they had made. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had outlawed discrimination in public accommodations, was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883. The message was clear. Black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. Jim Crow was rising, and part of its architecture was the segregation of railroad cars, forcing Black passengers, regardless of the tickets they had purchased, into smoking cars that were dirty, poorly maintained, and deliberately degrading. When the conductor told Ida to move from the first-class ladies' car she had paid for to the smoking car, she refused. She knew exactly what that car represented, not just physical discomfort, but a deliberate assertion that she was inferior, that her money was not as good as white people's money, that she did not deserve the dignity of the seat she had purchased. When he tried to force her, she fought back with everything she had. She bit his hand so hard he screamed. She braced her feet against the seat. It took the conductor and 2 other men to drag her from the car, and even then she did not make it easy for them. Her dress tore, her hat flew off. Blood rushed to her face as passengers watched, some cheering for the men, some sitting in uncomfortable silence. But what they would remember most was not her humiliation, it was her resistance. It was the way she refused to be moved without a fight. When they finally got her off the train, she did not slink away in shame. She sued the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Company for damages. The fact that she sued was remarkable. That a Black woman, a teacher making barely enough to support herself and her siblings, would take on a railroad company was almost unthinkable. But Ida had been raised by a father who believed in Black political rights and a mother who had insisted on dignity. She had been forged by the early death of her parents into someone who understood that she was the only one who could save herself and those she loved. She had already survived what many would consider the worst that life could throw at a young black woman in the South. A railroad company did not frighten her. In 1885, a local court ruled in her favor, awarding her $500 in damages. The victory was sweet and short-lived. The railroad company appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court, which overturned the decision in 1887, forcing her to pay court costs. But something had shifted inside Ida B. Wells. The experience had opened her eyes to the systemic nature of injustice. It had shown her that the law, which should have protected her rights as a citizen, was instead being used as a weapon against her people, and it had revealed to her that her fight mattered to others. Black newspapers across the country had covered her case. People she had never met knew her name and cheered her courage. She began to write. At first, she wrote for local black newspapers under the pen name Iola, writing about education, about the condition of black schools in Memphis, about the dignity and aspirations of black people. Her articles were sharp, uncompromising, and fearless. She criticized black people when she thought they were complacent or when black schools were failing students. She criticized white people for their hypocrisy and their violence. She wrote with a clarity and a moral force that attracted attention. Her voice was distinctive, educated, but accessible, passionate but precise, unafraid to name names and challenge power directly. In 1889, she became co-owner and editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, a black newspaper. She was 27 years old, still teaching full-time and now running a newspaper. She wrote editorials that pushed boundaries, that said things other editors were afraid to say. She investigated conditions in black schools and published her findings even when they embarrassed black school boards. She called out white businesses that discriminated against black customers. She documented incidents of violence and intimidation. She was building a reputation as someone who could not be bought, could not be intimidated, and would not be silent. She did not yet know that this platform would almost cost her her life. She did not yet know that she was about to stumble onto the story that would define her legacy and shake America to its core. But she was ready. Everything in her life had been preparing her for what came next. Thomas Moss was Ida's friend. He was more than that. Really, he was the kind of friend who feels like family. The kind whose children you hold and whose wife becomes your sister in all but blood. Thomas Moss was a letter carrier for the U.S. Postal Service, a position of respect in the black community because it was a federal job, one of the few positions where black men could work without being subject to the whims of white employers. He was also the co-owner of the People's Grocery Company, a black-owned store in a neighborhood on the outskirts of Memphis known as The Curve. The Curve was a mostly black neighborhood, and the People's Grocery had been opened specifically to serve that community. Thomas Moss had gone into business with two partners, Calvin McDowell and Will Stewart, men who had saved their money and taken the risk of entrepreneurship. They extended credit to families when times were hard. They gave fair weight and fair prices. They became a gathering place where men came not just to buy supplies but to talk, to share news, to build community. The store succeeded because it served the community well and because black customers were tired of being overcharged and mistreated at white-owned stores. But success was dangerous for black men in Jim Crow Memphis. Across the street from the People's Grocery was a white-owned store run by William Barrett, a man who had held a monopoly on the neighborhood's trade until the People's Grocery opened. Barrett watched his customer base shrink as black shoppers chose to give their money to black owners who treated them with respect. He watched his profits decline, and he began to spread rumors that the men at the People's Grocery were keeping guns in the store, that they were dangerous, that they were a threat to white people in the neighborhood. On March 9, 1892, the tension that had been building erupted. A fight broke out between black and white boys playing marbles near the two stores. It was the kind of fight that boys have always had and always will have, but in Jim Crow Memphis it became something more. The fight escalated, adults got involved. William Barrett and his allies decided to teach those black men a lesson. They gathered a group and planned to attack the People's Grocery that Saturday night. But Thomas Moss and his partners, knowing they were targets, knowing how these things ended in the South, had prepared. They had armed themselves. They had posted guards. They had made it clear that they would defend their property, their investment, their lives. When the mob of white men came after dark, storming the store, shots were fired. 3 of the white attackers were wounded. None were killed, but blood had been drawn. And in the mathematics of white supremacy, that meant that black blood would have to flow in return. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart were arrested. They were charged not with defending their property, which should have been their right, but with assault. They were thrown in jail to await trial. Everyone in the black community knew what came next. Everyone had heard the stories of jails that could not keep mobs out, of sheriffs who looked the other way, of legal proceedings that never happened because the defendant never made it to court. The black community in Memphis begged the authorities to protect the prisoners. They pleaded with the governor to send the militia. They offered to post guards themselves. Their pleas were ignored. In the early morning hours of March 9, 1892, a mob of white men, some of them prominent citizens, some of them members of respectable families, took the keys to the jail from a compliant or complicit jailer. They removed Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart from their cells. They loaded them onto a train car that took them beyond the city limits, beyond the jurisdiction of Memphis law, though law was not going to save them anyway. And there, in a field outside the city, they murdered 3 innocent men. Thomas Moss, seeing his death coming, asked only that his life insurance policy be given to his family. His last words, according to the few testimonies that survived, were, "Tell my people to go west. There is no justice for them here." Calvin McDowell was brutally tortured before he was killed, mutilated in ways that testified to the sadistic pleasure the murderers took in their work. Will Stewart fought until the end. And when it was over, their bodies were left where they fell. A message to every black person in Memphis about the cost of success, the price of self-defense, the futility of expecting justice. Ida B. Wells was away when the lynching happened. She was in Natchez, Mississippi, on a journalism assignment. When she returned and learned what had been done to her friend, to Betty Moss's husband, to little Maureen's father, she was shattered in a way she had not been since her parents died. But this time, instead of grief driving her inward, into survival mode, it drove her outward, into rage and determination. She went to see Betty Moss, who was drowning in grief and terror, left alone with 2 young children and no way to support them. She looked into Maureen's face and saw the incomprehension of a child who does not understand why her father has not come home, and something inside Ida B. Wells broke and reformed into something harder, sharper, more dangerous to the system that had killed her friend. At first, she believed what she had been taught to believe, what even many black people accepted as awful but somehow justified, that lynchings happened to black men who committed crimes, particularly the crime of raping white women. She hated lynching. A decent person would, but she had believed there was at least a terrible logic to it. But now she looked at the facts with clear eyes, unblinded by propaganda. Thomas Moss had been lynched for economic competition. He had been murdered for the crime of succeeding, for taking business away from a white man, for daring to believe that black people had the right to build wealth in their own community. If they could kill Thomas Moss for owning a successful grocery store, then the rape narrative had to be examined, questioned, torn apart, and inspected for the lie that it might be. Ida began to investigate systematically. She started collecting newspaper clippings about lynchings from across the South, reading them not to accept what they said, but to question it, to look for patterns, to test the official narrative against the facts. She talked to people who had witnessed lynchings or knew the victims. She traveled to small towns where lynchings had occurred and interviewed people, gathered testimonies, documented what had really happened as opposed to what newspapers reported. What she discovered was a campaign of terror so vast and so systematic that it took her breath away. Between 1882 and 1892, more than 1,000 black people had been lynched in the South, men, women, sometimes even children. The methods were horrific: hanging, burning alive, mutilation, shooting, torture that seemed designed to inflict maximum suffering before death. These murders were often carried out in public, advertised in advance, in newspapers attended by thousands of white spectators who brought their children, who cheered and celebrated, who took photographs and made postcards of black bodies hanging from trees and sold them as souvenirs. Newspapers routinely justified these murders by claiming the victim had raped or attempted to rape a white woman. But as Ida dug deeper, she found that in case after case, the rape charge was false. Sometimes there had been no relationship at all between the victim and any white woman. Sometimes the relationship had been consensual, an affair that could not be acknowledged without destroying the myth of white womanhood's purity and white men's control over white women. Sometimes the charge was simply fabricated as an excuse to murder a black man who had become too successful, too politically active, too assertive of his rights. The rape narrative, Ida realized with growing horror and fury, was a convenient lie that allowed white Americans to justify murder, to turn black men into monsters in the public imagination, to make it impossible for anyone to defend them without appearing to condone sexual violence. Ida B. Wells did something that would require a special kind of courage, the kind of courage that knows exactly how much danger it is walking into and walks forward anyway. She wrote the truth. In the pages of the Free Speech, she published an editorial that said what no one else dared to say: that many allegations of rape were false, that in some cases the relationships between black men and white women were consensual, and that white women were using false accusations as weapons because their actual relationships with black men would destroy the myth of white supremacy. She wrote, "Nobody in this section of the country believes the old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women." The reaction was swift and volcanic. White newspapers called for her death. White men vowed to find her and kill her. On May 27, 1892, while Ida was away in Philadelphia attending a conference, a white mob stormed the offices of the Free Speech Destroyed. The printing press smashed the windows, wrecked the furniture, and left a message that if Ida B. Wells ever returned to Memphis, she would be hanged from a lamppost in front of the courthouse and her face would be burned with acid. She never returned to Memphis. She could not. To do so would be suicide. The city that had been her home for 12 years, where she had built a career and a life, where she had friends and connections and a community, was now a place where her presence would mean her death. She was 30 years old, and in a single moment she had lost her newspaper, her home, her livelihood, and her ability to live in the South. But she had gained something too. She had gained absolute clarity about her mission. She had looked into the heart of American darkness and found the monster's name. And she had decided that she would spend the rest of her life making sure that everyone else learned that name too. Ida B. Wells landed in New York with almost nothing but a burning sense of purpose and a story that needed to be told. She was taken in by T. Thomas Fortune, editor of the New York Age, one of the most prominent black newspapers in the country. Fortune understood immediately what she had: the most comprehensive investigation of lynching that had ever been compiled, documented with names, dates, places, and the real reasons black people were being murdered. He offered her a job as a writer and a platform to reach thousands of readers. She took both, and immediately got to work. In June 1892, just weeks after fleeing Memphis, Ida wrote a 10,000-word investigative piece for the New York Age, detailing the facts about lynching in America. The article was meticulously researched and devastating in its conclusions. She presented case after case where the official narrative did not match the facts, where the rape accusation was clearly false, or where no accusation had been made at all until after the murder. She documented lynchings for political organizing, for economic competition, for talking back, for simply being successful. She presented statistics showing that only a third of lynching victims were even accused of rape, and that many of those accusations were transparently false. The article was reprinted and distributed widely throughout the black press, reaching readers across the country. She followed it with a pamphlet called Southern Horrors: Lynch Law in All Its Phases, which sold thousands of copies, and brought the truth about lynching to readers who had never heard this perspective before. For the first time, someone was presenting lynching not as isolated incidents of frontier justice, but as a systematic campaign of racial terror designed to maintain white supremacy through fear. The pamphlet was funded by a group of black women in New York, who raised money specifically to help Ida continue her crusade. It was the beginning of a pattern that would sustain her work for decades. Black women, often invisible in the historical record, funding and supporting the activism that changed America. The statistics she compiled were damning. The testimonies she gathered were heartbreaking. The analysis was razor-sharp. Ida B. Wells argued that lynching was not about protecting white women, it was about protecting white power. It was economic terrorism designed to prevent black people from accumulating wealth and competing with white businesses. It was political terrorism designed to prevent black people from voting and holding office. It was social terrorism designed to keep black people subordinate and afraid. And the rape mythology was the ideological cover that allowed white Americans, even those who considered themselves good people, to look away from murder and call it justice. She did not stop at documentation. She called for action. She urged black people to leave the South, to take their labor and their talent to places where they might be safe. She urged black people to arm themselves, to defend their homes and their lives when the law would not. She urged black people in the North to use their economic power to boycott products from lynching states, to refuse to subsidize their own oppression. And she urged white Americans, particularly white women who claimed to care about morality and justice, to speak out against lynching, to use their influence to stop the murders that were happening in their name. Her work attracted powerful enemies. Southern newspapers denounced her in the vilest terms. She received death threats regularly, letters describing in graphic detail what would be done to her if she ever showed her face in the South again. But her work also attracted powerful allies. In 1893, she was invited to Great Britain to speak about lynching to British audiences. She embarked on a speaking tour that took her to churches, women's clubs, and public halls across England, Scotland, and Wales. British audiences were horrified by what she told them. They could not believe that such atrocities were happening in America, a nation that claimed to be civilized and democratic. British newspapers covered her speeches extensively. The British public began to pressure American institutions, missionary societies, businesses with interests in the American South. American missionaries working in Britain found themselves interrogated about the violence in their home country and could not answer. Ida returned to America with a new weapon: international shame. She went back to Britain in 1894 for a second, even more extensive tour. She was turning lynching into an international scandal, forcing America to confront its hypocrisy on the world stage. The nation that claimed to be spreading civilization and democracy around the world could not explain why it was allowing its own citizens to be tortured and murdered without trial. But the work was exhausting and dangerous in ways both obvious and subtle. She was constantly traveling, constantly speaking, constantly fighting. She lived out of suitcases, stayed in the homes of strangers, ate irregular meals, slept in unfamiliar beds. She stood before hostile audiences who came to heckle and threaten her. She read her own name in newspapers alongside calls for her death. She carried with her always the knowledge that she was documenting horrors, that every case she investigated was a human being who had been tortured and killed, a family that had been destroyed. The trauma of this work, the constant exposure to humanity's capacity for cruelty, took a toll that she rarely acknowledged but that shaped her personality and her relationships. She was doing the work of 10 people, and she was doing it without institutional support, without wealth, without the protection that white women reformers took for granted. White women activists could travel with relative safety, could speak without fearing for their lives, could return to comfortable homes and supportive families. Ida had none of that. She was also profoundly lonely. She had lost her home in Memphis, lost her newspaper, lost many of her closest relationships. The friends she had left were scattered across the country. Many of her friendships had been strained by distance and by the intensity and all-consuming nature of her work. She was becoming one of the most famous Black women in America. But fame is cold comfort when you are fighting a war that never ends and have no place to lay down your weapons, no one to hold you when the nightmares come. In 1895, at age 33, Ida B. Wells married Ferdinand Lee Barnett, a widowed attorney and editor of the Chicago Conservator, one of the first Black newspapers in Chicago. It was not a decision she made lightly or quickly. She had built an identity as a crusader, a truth-teller, a woman who went where the story took her without asking anyone's permission. Marriage in the 1890s meant submitting to coverture laws that stripped women of legal identity, meant being expected to retire from public life, meant prioritizing a husband's needs and desires above one's own ambitions. She had watched other women activists marry and disappear from public life, their voices silenced by the demands of domesticity. She knew what marriage might cost her, but she also knew what loneliness was costing her. The work she did was brutal and isolating. She traveled constantly, often staying in the homes of strangers, living out of suitcases, speaking to hostile crowds, receiving death threats, carrying the weight of documenting humanity's cruelty toward her people. She had no home base, no place that was truly hers, no one who held her when the nightmares came. She was becoming one of the most famous Black women in America. But fame is cold comfort when you are fighting a war and have no one to come home to, no one who knows you as more than the crusader, who remembers that underneath the armor you are human. Ferdinand Barnett was different from the men who had courted her before. He was a graduate of Union College of Law at Northwestern University, one of the first Black lawyers in Chicago. He was a founder of the Conservator, which had been the first Black newspaper in Chicago when he started it in 1878. He was a widower raising 3 sons and understood what it meant to balance work and family, to love someone and still give them space to be themselves. He was a committed activist who had founded the first civic organization for Black men in Illinois. Most importantly, he understood Ida's calling and never asked her to choose between him and her work. When other men had courted her with the expectation that she would retire into domestic bliss, Ferdinand had courted her with the understanding that she was Ida B. Wells first, last, and always, and that being her partner meant supporting her mission, not constraining it. When they married on June 27, 1895, Ida became Ida B. Wells Barnett, keeping her own name in an era when women routinely disappeared into their husbands' identities. This was not just a personal preference, it was a political statement. It said that marriage did not erase her, that she was still herself, still the journalist and activist who had stared down lynch mobs and British audiences. The hyphenated name was unusual enough that newspapers commented on it, some approving, many disapproving, all recognizing it as a statement of independence unusual for the time. They merged their households and their work. Ferdinand had a beautiful home on Rhodes Avenue in Chicago, spacious enough for his 3 sons and now for Ida. She helped run the Conservator while continuing her anti-lynching work. Ferdinand practiced law and supported her campaigns, both emotionally and practically. They created a partnership that was rare for their time, 2 ambitious, talented people who enlarged each other's lives, rather than diminishing them, who understood that love meant supporting each other's fullest expression rather than constraining each other to fit conventional roles. But motherhood, when it came, brought new complications that Ida had not fully anticipated. Their first child, Charles H. Barnett, was born in March 1896, less than a year into their marriage. Ida was 33 years old, and she fell completely in love with her son in a way that surprised her. She had been a mother to her siblings from age 16, had carried the responsibility of children for half her life, but this was different. Charles was hers in a way nothing else had ever been. She nursed him, rocked him, sang to him, felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. She discovered depths of tenderness in herself that the harsh work of activism had not allowed her to explore. She also discovered that the world had very different expectations for mothers than it did for single women crusaders. When she had been unmarried, traveling and speaking constantly, she had been criticized as unwomanly, as too aggressive, as unfeminine, but at least she had been allowed to do the work. Now, as a mother, she found that every decision was scrutinized through the lens of maternal propriety. When she went on a speaking tour 5 months after Charles was born, bringing him with her, because she was still nursing, she was criticized in the press for dragging an infant on the road, for exposing him to the dangers and discomforts of travel. When she left him at home with Ferdinand and her sister-in-law so she could do her work, she was criticized for abandoning her child, for prioritizing her ambition over her maternal duties. There was, she discovered, no way to be both a good mother and a public crusader in the eyes of society. Whatever she chose, someone would condemn her for it. The White Women's Club movement, which was gaining significant power during this period, had very specific ideas about motherhood and women's proper role. They celebrated women's moral superiority and argued that women should use their influence to reform society, but they also insisted that women's primary duty was to their homes and children, that women could be reformers only by first being perfect mothers and wives. Black women's clubs, which Ida had been instrumental in organizing, took a more expansive view by necessity. Black mothers had always worked outside the home. Poverty and racism made it impossible to survive otherwise. Black women had always been activists because their children's lives depended on changing the systems that oppressed them. But even within Black activist circles, there were murmurs that perhaps Ida should scale back now, should focus on her family, should let others carry the torch for a while. Ida B. Wells Barnett refused. She understood the stakes in a way that many of her critics, protected by distance or privilege or willful ignorance, did not. She had documented hundreds of lynchings. She had read testimonies that described torture so sadistic it defied belief. She had looked into the faces of widows and orphans left behind when mobs did their terrible work. She knew that if she stopped speaking, if she let the horror fade back into comfortable silence, then Thomas Moss and all the others would have died for nothing. More than that, she knew that her own children were growing up in a world where their father or brothers could be lynched at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. The work she was doing was not separate from motherhood. It was an extension of it. She was fighting to create a world where her children might be safe, where they might grow up without the constant fear that shaped every Black person's life in America. So she found ways to do it all, though the cost was high and the juggling act exhausting. She hired help when she could afford it, leaning on Ferdinand's financial stability as a successful attorney. She brought her children with her when she couldn't leave them behind. Her second son, Herman Colesop Barnett, was born in November 1897. Her daughter Ida B. Wells Barnett Jr. was born in 1901. Her youngest daughter, Alfreda, came in 1904. She nursed babies while writing articles. She planned protests during nap times. She attended civil rights meetings with infants on her hip. She made herself into something the world had never seen before, and didn't quite know what to do with. A mother who was also a revolutionary, a woman who refused to believe that bringing life into the world meant abandoning the fight to make that world livable. In 1898, she traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with President William McKinley, bringing with her evidence of a recent lynching in South Carolina and demanding that he take federal action. She documented the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, when white supremacists staged a coup against the legitimately elected biracial government of Wilmington, North Carolina, murdering Black citizens and driving Black leaders out of the city at gunpoint. She investigated and reported on race riots in Atlanta in 1906 and in Springfield, Illinois in 1908. Every time white violence erupted, every time Black bodies were left hanging from trees or burned beyond recognition. Ida B. Wells Barnett was there with her notebook and her pen, documenting the truth, demanding accountability, refusing to let America forget what it had done. She also continued to build institutions. In 1896, she organized the National Association of Colored Women, bringing together Black women's clubs from across the country into a unified national organization. She founded the Negro Fellowship League in Chicago, which provided housing and job assistance to Black men migrating from the South. She fought for women's suffrage, arguing passionately that Black women needed the vote, both as women and as members of a community under siege. She was a founding member of the NAACP, though she would later have bitter conflicts with the organization over strategy and leadership. But the truth is that being Ida B. Wells Barnett was a hard and often thankless calling. She made enemies not just among white supremacists but within the civil rights movement itself. She was uncompromising in her criticism, willing to call out anyone, black or white, male or female, who she believed was not doing enough or was compromising too much. In an era when black leaders often felt they had to be diplomatic, had to carefully manage white public opinion, had to accept half measures because full justice seemed impossible, Ida refused to moderate her demands or soften her critiques. She clashed repeatedly with Booker T. Washington, the most powerful and influential black leader of his time. Washington, who led the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, preached a philosophy of accommodation and economic self-improvement. He argued that black people should focus on learning trades, accumulating property, and proving their worth through hard work. Rather than agitating for political rights and social equality, he counseled patience, suggesting that if black people made themselves economically indispensable and morally beyond reproach, white people would eventually grant them full citizenship rights. His 1895 Atlanta Compromise speech, in which he seemed to accept segregation in exchange for economic opportunity, made him the darling of white philanthropists and many white Southerners who appreciated a black leader who did not challenge the racial hierarchy directly. Ida B. Wells Barnett found Washington's approach morally bankrupt and strategically disastrous. How could black people prove their worth when they were being lynched by the thousands? How could they accumulate property when white mobs destroyed black businesses and communities on a whim? How could they pursue education when their schools were systematically underfunded, and when educated black people were often targeted precisely for being uppity or ambitious? She criticized Washington publicly and forcefully, arguing that his accommodationist stance gave white supremacists permission to continue their reign of terror, while blaming black people for their own oppression. She pointed out that Washington's influence was being used to silence more militant black voices, that white philanthropists donated to Tuskegee precisely because Washington did not threaten white power. This made her powerful enemies. Washington controlled access to significant philanthropic funding that many black institutions depended on. He had relationships with presidents and industrialists. He could make or break careers with a word in the right ear or the withdrawal of support. Many black leaders, even those who privately agreed with Ida's critiques, were afraid to challenge Washington publicly for fear of losing funding or being shut out of opportunities. Ida B. Wells Barnett was not afraid. She could not be bought or intimidated into silence, and this made her dangerous to those who preferred consensus to truth, who valued institutional stability over moral clarity. She also had contentious relationships with other leaders of the nascent NAACP, the organization she had helped found. In 1909, after a brutal race riot in Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's hometown, of all places, a group of white and black reformers came together to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Ida B. Wells Barnett was there at the founding, her research on lynching providing crucial documentation for the organization's mission statement and early campaigns. But from the beginning, there were tensions that would eventually push her to the margins of the organization she had helped create. Many of the white founders, while genuinely committed to racial justice by the standards of their time, brought paternalistic attitudes that were typical of progressive reformers. They assumed leadership roles and expected black members to defer to white judgment on matters of strategy and tactics. The organization's early leadership was dominated by white progressives like Mary White Ovington and Oswald Garrison Viller, who meant well but did not always understand the urgency or the complexity of what black people faced, the ways in which their own whiteness shielded them from the daily violence and humiliation of Jim Crow. Ida clashed with them over strategy and over control. She believed black people should lead black organizations, that white allies were welcome, but should not dominate the conversation or assume they knew better than the people who actually lived under racial oppression. She believed in direct action and confrontation rather than the careful, incremental approach that many white NAACP leaders preferred. The approach of endless meetings and careful lobbying that never seemed to actually stop anyone from being lynched. She also clashed with W.E.B. Du Bois, the brilliant scholar and activist who became editor of the NAACP's magazine, The Crisis. Du Bois and Wells Barnett agreed on many things. Both opposed Washington's accommodationism. Both believed in agitating for full civil rights immediately, rather than accepting gradualism. Both understood the power of the pen to shape public opinion and mobilize communities. But they had different styles and different priorities, and perhaps most importantly, Du Bois was a man in an era when men expected deference from women. Even brilliant, accomplished women like Ida B. Wells Barnett, she did not defer. She spoke her mind in meetings, often forcefully and at length. She criticized strategies she disagreed with, sometimes in public. She demanded equal voice and equal authority, refused to be talked over or dismissed. Du Bois, like many men of his era, regardless of their progressive politics, found this threatening. He was accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, and did not always welcome challenges to his ideas, especially not from a woman who was just as smart, just as educated, just as accomplished, and far more experienced in the practical work of anti-lynching activism. The result was that Ida B. Wells Barnett, despite being one of the most important anti-lynching activists in America, despite having done groundbreaking investigative work that laid the foundation for the entire movement, was gradually marginalized within the NAACP. She was not given leadership positions commensurate with her contributions. Her ideas were often ignored or, worse, adopted and then credited to men. She found herself shut out of meetings where important decisions were made, passed over for speaking opportunities that went to less experienced activists who were easier to work with. By 1912, she had largely withdrawn from national NAACP work. Frustrated by the politics and by the lack of respect for her expertise and experience, choosing instead to focus on local activism in Chicago, where she could work without having to navigate the egos and power dynamics of national organizations. But history could not erase the work she did. The pamphlets she wrote, the investigations she conducted, the testimonies she gathered became the foundation for every anti-lynching campaign that followed. The institutions she built, the organizations she founded, the networks she created became infrastructure for the civil rights movement. The example she set of a black woman who refused silence, who looked into terror's face and said no more, echoed through generations. Rosa Parks knew about Ida B. Wells Barnett. Fannie Lou Hamer knew her story. Ella Baker studied her methods. The women who organized the Montgomery bus boycott, who sat at lunch counters, who registered voters in Mississippi, they walked in footsteps Ida carved into hard ground. They inherited her courage. Now, as America reckons again with racial violence as long shadow, as cell phones document what Ida documented with her pen, her work is being rediscovered. Young activists read her words and find them urgent and necessary. Scholars recognize her as a founding mother of investigative journalism, anti-lynching activism, black feminism, the idea that ordinary people can document injustice and demand change. In 2020, Ida B. Wells Barnett received a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for her outstanding and courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching. 90 years too late, but an acknowledgement that what she did mattered, that the risks she took were not in vain, that her voice still speaks. If you are a black woman in America today, you are living in a house that Ida B. Wells helped build. Every right you have, every door that is open to you, every moment when you speak your truth and expect to be heard, these things exist because women like Ida B. Wells decided that they would not be silent, even when silence would have kept them safe. The ground you stand on was purchased with her courage, her sacrifice, her refusal to accept that the world had to be the way it was. Think about what that means in concrete terms. When you go to vote, you are exercising a right that women like Ida fought for. Marching in suffrage parades when white suffragists tried to make black women invisible, demanding that black women's voices be counted equally with all others. When you attend a school or university, especially if it is predominantly white or if you are the first in your family to go to college, you are walking through doors that activists like Ida kept pushing on, documenting the inequality of segregated education, demanding that black children deserve the same resources as white children, insisting that intelligence has no color, and that black minds have just as much right to be educated as white minds. When you own a business, when you accumulate wealth, when you pass that wealth to your children, you are doing something that black people in Ida's time were killed for attempting. The People's Grocery was destroyed and its owners were murdered precisely because they had dared to compete economically with white businesses. The very fact that you can aspire to economic success without fearing that a white mob will burn down your business and murder you for being too successful, that relative safety, imperfect as it still is, exists because people like Ida documented the economic terrorism of lynching and made it impossible for America to pretend it was about anything other than maintaining white power and white economic control through fear. When you see a black woman journalist investigating injustice and holding power accountable, when you see someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones creating the 1619 Project or Joy Reid speaking truth on television, you are seeing Ida's legacy. When you see a black woman activist speaking truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, when you see someone like Tarana Burke starting the #MeToo movement or Alicia Garza co-founding Black Lives Matter, you are seeing her methods replicated and updated for a new generation. When you see a black woman refuse to be silenced, refuse to accept half measures, refuse to be patient when patience means more people will die or suffer, you are seeing her spirit alive in a new generation of warriors who understand what she understood. That silence in the face of injustice is complicity. She understood something that is still true today, something that black women are still learning and relearning generation after generation. that Black women have always been on the front lines of the fight for justice, not because they wanted to be warriors, but because they had no choice. The violence that was done to Black men threatened Black women's fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers. When Thomas Moss was lynched, it was not just his family that suffered, but the entire community that lost a father, a husband, a business owner, a leader. The poverty that was imposed on Black communities fell most heavily on Black women who had to find ways to feed and clothe and educate children with almost nothing, who had to stretch every penny and make something out of nothing and carry the weight when men were denied work or imprisoned or killed. The lies that were told about Black people were often specifically lies about Black women's virtue, Black women's intelligence, Black women's worth. Ida faced all of this. She was called immoral for exposing the lie of the rape myth, called unwomanly for refusing to be silent, called a bad mother for continuing her activism after having children. She was subject to all the same stereotypes and slurs that are still used to demean and dismiss Black women today. So Black women fought back, not as an optional act of heroism, but as a necessary act of survival. If Black women did not fight, who would? Who would defend their children, their communities, their futures? Ida B. Wells Barnett's story teaches us that this fight is our inheritance and our responsibility, that we are part of a long line of women who refused to accept the world as it was and fought to make it what it should be. It teaches us that documentation matters, that bearing witness is a revolutionary act. When Ida began collecting statistics on lynching, when she interviewed witnesses and published their testimonies, when she compiled evidence that could not be dismissed or ignored, she was doing something that had never been done before. She was taking the scattered individual horrors that white newspapers either ignored or lied about, and weaving them into an undeniable pattern that proved lynching was not isolated incidents of justice gone wrong, but a systematic campaign of racial terror designed to keep Black people subordinate. That method: document, testify, make the invisible visible, make the deniable undeniable, is as urgent today as it was in 1892. We live in an era when cell phones capture what Ida had to document with her pen and her notebook. We live in a time when hashtags can do what her pamphlets did, making individual incidents part of a visible pattern that cannot be dismissed as isolated or exceptional. We live in a moment when the names of Black people killed by police or vigilantes circulate the way Ida circulated the names of lynching victims: George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, so many others, whose names we know because someone documented what happened to them, because someone refused to let their deaths be forgotten or explained away. The technology has changed, but the need to document, to testify, to make injustice visible remains the same. Every time you share a video of police brutality, every time you say a victim's name, every time you refuse to let an injustice be forgotten, you are doing Ida B. Wells's work. You are bearing witness. You are making the invisible visible. You are refusing to let the story be controlled by those in power. Her story also teaches us that we do not have to wait for permission to fight for justice, that we do not need credentials or degrees or institutional backing to say what is true. Ida was not a lawyer or a doctor or a person with formal power or connections to wealth and influence. She was a schoolteacher turned journalist. She had a pen, a printing press, and an unshakable conviction that truth mattered and that someone had to tell it. That was enough. She did not wait for someone to give her permission to investigate lynchings. She did not wait for an organization to endorse her methods or validate her approach. She did not wait for male leaders to tell her that her voice mattered or that her work was important. She saw something that was wrong, something that was destroying her community and her people, and she used the tools she had to fight it. She gave herself permission to do the work that needed doing. This is a crucial lesson for any Black woman who has ever been told she is not qualified enough, not credentialed enough, not important enough to speak up, to lead, to demand change. Those voices that tell you to wait your turn, to be more patient, to let someone else handle it, to stay in your lane, those voices are the same ones that tried to silence Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was qualified by her humanity, by her citizenship, by her moral clarity, by her refusal to accept that human beings could be tortured and murdered without consequence. She gave herself permission to do the work, and you have that same authority. You do not need anyone to tell you that you are allowed to document injustice, to speak truth, to demand change. You are allowed because you are human, because you have eyes to see and a voice to speak and a conscience that demands action. Your witness matters. Your voice matters. Your refusal to accept injustice matters. Her story also teaches us that the cost of speaking up is real, but that the cost of silence is higher. Ida lost her home, lost her newspaper, lost her ability to live in the South, lived under constant threat of violence for the rest of her life. She was criticized, marginalized, shut out of opportunities she deserved. She was called difficult and angry and too radical. The work she did cost her in ways both visible and invisible, the friendships strained by her uncompromising stance. The exhaustion of carrying such weight for so long, the trauma of documenting horror after horror, the loneliness of being ahead of her time and having to wait for others to catch up, having to fight not just external enemies but also the people who should have been her allies. These costs were real. They hurt. They took a toll on her body, her relationships, her peace of mind. But what would have been the cost of her silence? Thomas Moss and all the others would have been forgotten, their deaths erased from history or justified by lies. The systematic nature of lynching would have remained hidden, allowing white Americans to continue believing the comforting myth that these were isolated incidents of frontier justice rather than a campaign of racial terror. Future activists would have had no foundation to build on, no methods to replicate, no evidence to point to when they tried to convince people that something had to change. The anti-lynching movement, which eventually did reduce the number of lynchings dramatically and changed public opinion about racial violence, would have been weaker or might not have existed at all. Countless lives that were saved by the increased scrutiny and public pressure her work generated would have been lost. The progress we have made, imperfect and incomplete as it is, would not have happened, or would have happened more slowly, and more people would have suffered and died in the meantime. Ida B. Wells Barnett teaches us that we can be both warriors and women who love and laugh and build families and lives. That we do not have to choose between being effective activists and being whole human beings. This is perhaps one of her most important legacies for Black women who are so often expected to choose between personal happiness and the struggle for justice, between being good mothers and being effective activists, between caring for our communities and caring for ourselves. The world wants to force us into these false choices, wants us to believe that if we care about ourselves and our families, we cannot also care about the movement, and if we care about the movement, we must sacrifice ourselves and our families. Ida refused that false choice. She married, she had 4 children and helped raise 3 stepchildren. She created a home that was full of love and laughter and the ordinary joys of family life. She celebrated birthdays and holidays. She cooked meals. She helped with homework. She was present for her children in ways that mattered, and they grew up knowing they were loved. And she also traveled constantly, spoke on stages across the country and across the Atlantic, investigated lynchings, founded organizations, ran for political office, published articles and pamphlets, and fought tirelessly for justice. She did both. She was both. It was not easy. How could it be? She was exhausted much of the time. She was criticized from all sides, criticized by whites for being too radical, criticized by some Black leaders for being too uncompromising, criticized by women's clubs for not being domestic enough, criticized by everyone for having the audacity to be a mother and a revolutionary at the same time. She made compromises and sacrifices that no one should have to make, but she proved that it was possible to be a whole person, to have a full life that included both personal joy and public struggle, to refuse the demand that women be only one thing. For Black women today who are still expected to be everything to everyone, to be strong for our communities, nurturing for our families, excellent in our careers, always available, always gracious, always able to carry everyone else's burdens, while never admitting to having burdens of our own, never showing weakness, never asking for help. Eda's example is liberation. She shows us that we can set boundaries, that we can prioritize our work even when others think we should prioritize differently, that we can be imperfect and human and still be effective. She loved her children fiercely, but she did not pretend that motherhood erased her calling or her responsibility to fight for justice. She was a good wife, but she did not let marriage diminish her or define her entirely. She was fully herself, and that fullness included both the domestic and the revolutionary, both the tender and the fierce. Her story also teaches us that we will make enemies when we fight for what is right, that we will be called names, difficult, angry, too much, not enough, never quite right-tanned, that these are badges of honor, not sources of shame. Every powerful person who criticized Ida for being too uncompromising, too aggressive, too unwilling to wait, was telling on themselves. They were revealing that they valued comfort over justice, that they valued their own position and influence over the lives of the people being lynched, that they were willing to settle for incremental change and symbolic victories when the situation demanded transformation and real change. They were revealing that they did not actually understand or could not fully feel the urgency of the crisis, the daily reality of living under terror. When people call you difficult because you refuse to accept injustice quietly, remember Ida and know that being called difficult by people who are comfortable with injustice is a compliment. When people call you angry because you respond to oppression with righteous rage rather than patient suffering, remember Ida and know that anger in the face of injustice is appropriate, is healthy, is necessary. When people suggest that you should be more diplomatic, more accommodating, more willing to work within the system, more patient with those who are harming you, ask yourself, what would Ida do? And if the answer is that she would refuse, that she would speak truth anyway, that she would prioritize the lives being destroyed over the feelings of people in power, then you know what you need to do. So, what does her story ask of you? It asks you to remember that you come from a line of warriors, women who faced horrors that should have broken them and instead chose to fight. It asks you to honor that legacy by refusing to be silent when you see injustice, by documenting what is wrong, by telling the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable. It asks you to build institutions and networks, to organize, to collaborate, to create structures that will outlast you. It asks you to be both compassionate and uncompromising, to care for your community and also to hold it accountable, to love Black people enough to demand that we be our best selves. It asks you to embrace the long game, to understand that change is generational, that you are planting trees whose shade you may never sit under. It asks you to make peace with being misunderstood, with being called names, with being shut out of rooms where decisions are made, and to keep fighting anyway. It asks you to find ways to do your work even when circumstances are not perfect, even when you are tired, even when you have 1,000 other responsibilities and only 24 hours in a day. But here is what Ida B. Wells Barnett's story promises you in return: that your life can matter, that your voice can echo across generations, that the work you do today can change what is possible tomorrow. It promises you that you are not alone, that you are part of a legacy of resistance that stretches back through time and forward, into a future that you are helping to create. It promises you that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to move forward despite fear, and that every time you make that decision, you are reshaping the world. When Ida B. Wells was dragged off that train in 1884, she could not have imagined where her resistance would lead. She could not have imagined the thousands of lives she would save, the millions of lives she would touch, the way her name would become synonymous with courage and truth-telling. She simply knew that she was worth the seat she had paid for, that she deserved to be treated with dignity, and that she was willing to fight for those truths, even if the fight cost her everything. That is the inheritance she left you. That is the torch she passed to you. That is the question her life puts to yours. What are you willing to fight for? What truths are you willing to tell, even when it costs you? What future are you willing to build, even if you never see it completed? Ida B. Wells Barnett lived fearlessly. She loved fiercely. She fought uncompromisingly. She documented truthfully. She never gave up. She never backed down. She looked into the abyss of American racism and did not flinch. She stared down mobs and presidents and editors and bishops and told them all the same thing: justice matters, Black lives matter, and I will not be silent. Her story is not over. It lives in every Black woman who speaks up when she could stay quiet, who fights back when she could give in, who builds when she could despair. It lives in every document that exposes injustice, in every organization that defends the vulnerable, in every voice that refuses to be silenced. It lives in you, if you choose to claim it. The question is not whether you have what it takes to be like Ida B. Wells. The question is whether you will honor her legacy by being fully, courageously, uncompromisingly yourself, by using whatever gifts you have to make the world more just, more honest, more free. The question is whether you will pick up the pen, the microphone, the protest sign, the laptop, whatever tool is in your hand, and say what needs to be said. The question is whether you will live as if your life matters, as if your voice matters, as if you have every right to demand justice and every responsibility to fight for it. Ida B. Wells Barnett died almost a century ago, but her work is not finished. The struggle she gave her life to is not over. The torch she carried is still burning, and she is passing it to you, right now, in this moment. The only question left is, what will you do with it?